And if you don't want to talk about where babies come from, you don't have to.
60 years ago this fall, CBS put a strange little premise on the air and asked America to believe it. A confirmed bachelor, an engineer with a penthouse apartment and no interest in children, suddenly finds himself raising his dead brother's 3 orphan kids, with an English gentleman's gentleman doing most of the actual parenting. It should not have worked. Sitcoms built on grief rarely do. But Family Affair ran for 5 seasons and 138 episodes from 1966 to 1971, and it became one of the gentlest, most quietly devastating shows of its era, because underneath the doll commercials and the penthouse set, it was always a show about what people do with loss. The 6 actors who carried that premise week after week were, in their own lives, about to find out exactly how much loss a person can carry. Some of them turned it into decades of purpose. Some of them did not get the chance. This is where they ended up. Start with the girl everyone remembers first, because she is the one the show made into a kind of American shorthand for innocence. Mary Anissa Jones was born on March 11, 1958, in Lafayette, Indiana, the daughter of an engineer father and a mother of Lebanese descent who had met at Purdue University. Her parents divorced not long after the family moved to California, and it was a neighbor's suggestion that sent her mother to a round of children's commercial auditions. A handful of commercials later, an 8-year-old with pale hair and an unusually calm screen presence was cast as Buffy Davis, the youngest of the 3 orphan children taken in by their Uncle Bill. She went by Anissa in real life and quietly corrected anyone who called her Buffy, but Buffy was what stuck, along with the cloth doll and glasses, and a polka dot dress that the character carried everywhere and spoke to as though it could speak back. Mrs. Beasley became one of the biggest merchandising phenomena of 1960s television, and it worked because Jones played that attachment with total sincerity. A doll that never changes, never leaves, and never disappoints is a very particular kind of comfort for a child, and orphan children on screen and off tend to understand that comfort better than anyone. Behind the cameras, Jones's home life was already complicated by a custody battle between her divorced parents, something viewers had no way of knowing while they watched Buffy solve small penthouse crises every Monday night. When the show ended its run in 1971, she was 13, old enough to feel embarrassed by a character frozen at 6, and young enough to have no real plan for what came next. The producers, by the show's own internal logic, had wanted Buffy preserved as perpetually childlike even as Jones visibly grew older during production, and that tension between the actress and the role she couldn't outgrow followed her off the set. She auditioned for other parts, including a serious run at playing Regan in The Exorcist, and lost the role to Linda Blair. Offers thinned out. She finished high school in Los Angeles, worked for a time at a donut shop, and by her own family's later accounts, she had started using drugs and shoplifting as her home situation deteriorated. When she turned 18 in the spring of 1976, she came into an inheritance from her Family Affair earnings, reported at the time to be worth a substantial sum, and by most accounts a large share of it was gone within months. On August 28, 1976, after a party the night before at a house in Oceanside, California, Anissa Jones was found dead in an upstairs bedroom. The coroner's ruling was combined drug intoxication, later classified as accidental. She was 18 years old, 5 years and 28 days removed from the final episode of the show that made her famous. Her younger brother, Paul, would die of a drug overdose himself in 1984 at 24. There was no third act for Anissa Jones. There was Buffy, sealed inside 138 episodes, and then there was nothing else. Her Uncle Bill was Brian Keith, and Keith's own story runs almost like a mirror image of hers, a life that looked settled and durable for decades before it broke apart with terrible speed at the very end. He was born Robert Alba Keith on November 14, 1921, in Bayonne, New Jersey, the son of the character actor Robert Keith, and he had been working in film and television since the 1950s by the time Family Affair began. The role of Bill Davis had actually been offered first to Glenn Ford, who turned it down. Keith, according to people who worked with him, had always been the producer's first real choice. He took the part and, unusually for a television actor of that period, negotiated a piece of ownership in the production itself, which gave him a different kind of leverage on set than any of his younger co-stars had. It also let him keep working in film during the show's run. Production was scheduled around him in blocks so he could take outside movie roles, a rare accommodation that says a great deal about how valuable the studio considered him. On screen, what made Bill Davis work was Keith's refusal to sentimentalize him. He didn't perform fatherhood as an instant transformation. He played a man visibly learning, episode by episode, what it meant to be needed by 3 children he had never planned to raise, and that slow, unresolved quality was what gave the show its emotional honesty. Off camera, cast members including Kathy Garver would later describe him as warm and unusually generous with the children, patient in a way that matched very little of his gruff on-screen persona. He earned 3 Emmy nominations for the role over the course of the series and never won. Keith kept working steadily for another quarter-century after the show ended, in films and later in the television series Hardcastle and McCormick, but the final years of his life collapsed on top of each other in a way that is hard to read about even decades later. In early 1997, he was diagnosed with lung cancer and emphysema, despite having quit smoking a decade earlier, and he began a punishing course of chemotherapy that left him weakened both physically and emotionally. He was also dealing with serious financial setbacks that year. Then, in April 1997, his 27-year-old daughter Daisy, an actress herself, died by suicide. Those close to Keith said the loss of Daisy was the blow he could not absorb on top of everything else. On June 24, 1997, roughly 10 weeks after his daughter's death, Brian Keith died by suicide at his home in Malibu. He was 75. He is buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park, his remains interred above his daughter's. The man who spent 5 seasons playing television's most reluctant, most steady guardian ended his own life in the middle of the least steady stretch it had ever put him through, and it is worth saying plainly that this was not some hidden contradiction in his character. Is simply what terminal illness and unbearable grief, arriving together, are capable of doing to anyone, regardless of what they once played on television. If Keith supplied the show's gruff center, Sebastian Cabot supplied its formality, and the contrast between the two of them was the engine of the whole series. Charles Sebastian Thomas Cabot was born in London on July 6, 1918, and his path into acting had nothing elegant about it. His father's business failed when Cabot was 14, and he left school to work as a garage hand, then a chef, then briefly a professional wrestler, before landing a job as a chauffeur and valet to the actor Frank Pettingell. It was from Pettingell that Cabot picked up the vocabulary and bearing that eventually talked his way into small acting parts, and by the 1950s, he had built a substantial career on both sides of the Atlantic, including film roles and, notably, a run of Disney voice work that gave him a second, quieter kind of fame. He narrated several of the original Winnie the Pooh featurettes and voiced Bagheera in The Jungle Book. He reportedly took the role of Mr. French on Family Affairs somewhat reluctantly, unconvinced the part offered much of a challenge, and was persuaded largely by the salary. What he built out of that reluctant decision became the role he is remembered for above all others. Mr. French was never written as a comic butler figure, played purely for laughs. Cabot brought a genuine, old-fashioned dignity to the character, formality that was constantly being asked to bend toward affection, and it worked precisely because Cabot played every one of those small surrenders as though they cost him something. Garver has said in interviews that it was the friction between Cabot's precision and Keith's rougher warmth that made the ensemble work as well as it did. Midway through the series, Cabot became seriously ill and had to step away from production for an extended stretch. The show rode around his absence by having Mr. French summoned back to England and brought in the veteran actor John Williams to play Mr. French's brother, Nigel, so the household still had someone minding it while Cabot recovered. He returned to finish out the series and continued working afterward, including a memorable turn as Kris Kringle in a 1973 television remake of Miracle on 34th Street, for which he had to shave the beard that had become part of his public image. But the illness that pulled him off Family Affair in the late 1960s was an early warning of what would eventually end his life. Cabot suffered a stroke in the mid-1970s that pushed him into semi-retirement near Victoria, British Columbia, and in August 1977, he suffered a second, more severe stroke at his home there. He was taken to a hospital in Victoria and died on August 23, 1977, at the age of 59. He was cremated, and his ashes were placed at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, not far from where Brian Keith would eventually be buried 2 decades later. Cabot built Mr. French out of contrast and restraint, and it remains one of the most fully realized supporting performances of its television era, cut short by exactly the kind of sudden medical event that no amount of composure can prepare a person for. Johnny Whitaker, who played Buffy's on-screen twin Jodie, has had the longest and, in many ways, the most redemptive second act of anyone connected to the show. Born John Orson Whitaker Jr. on December 13, 1959, in Van Nuys, California. He was cast at age 6 after Brian Keith, who had worked with him on the film The Russians Are Coming, recommended him to the producers. When they saw Whitaker alongside Anissa Jones, the show's writers changed the concept on the spot and made Jodie and Buffy twins, even though the two actors were more than a year apart in age. Whitaker gave the show its lighter register, the comic relief who could turn around and break your heart in the same scene, and unlike a lot of child performers of the period, his naturalism on camera never looked like performance at all. He continued acting steadily after Family Affair ended, including the title role in a 1973 musical film adaptation of Tom Sawyer, before slowing down as a young adult. Like many child stars of that era, Whitaker discovered as an adult that the earnings from his years of work had not been protected the way they should have been. Kathy Garver has spoken publicly about how little money was actually waiting for many of the show's young cast members once they turned 18, and Whitaker's case was part of that same pattern, a common failure of the industry before stronger child actor financial protections existed. His struggles with alcohol and drugs took hold in adulthood, following his divorce in 1988 and a subsequent personal tragedy he has described in interviews. A girlfriend who became pregnant with his child took her own life not long after the marriage ended, a loss he has called the most traumatic period of his life. Addiction followed, and it took a family intervention, one that reportedly threatened to cut off contact with him unless he sought help, to finally reach him. He got sober in 1998 and has stayed sober since becoming a certified drug and alcohol counselor and founding Paso por Paso, a nonprofit organization focused on helping Spanish-speaking addicts find recovery, work he has now continued for more than 2 decades. He returned briefly to acting in a 2002 Family Affair reunion special and has taken occasional roles since, including small parts in recent independent films, while continuing his counseling work and speaking to inmates in 12-step meetings at a county jail near his home. In 2026, at 66, he remains the cast member most publicly candid about what fame cost him and most active in trying to keep other people from paying that same price. He is not the freckle-faced boy America remembers, and by his own account he is glad of that. He built the rest of himself deliberately out of the wreckage. Kathy Garver, who played the eldest sibling, Sissy, is the one member of the principal cast whose life reads, from beginning to end, like the exception to almost everything that happened to the others. Kathleen Marie Garver was born on December 13, 1945, in Long Beach, California, and had already built a substantial career as a child performer, including a role in Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments before she was cast in Family Affair at 20, old enough to play a teenager convincingly while bringing an adult professional's discipline to the set. She stepped into the role at the last minute after the original actress cast as Sissy became unavailable during pilot production, and what the show got in return was its emotional anchor. Not the character who charmed audiences with cuteness, but the one who held the household together, the big sister managing her own grief while helping steady Buffy and Jodie under the roof of an uncle who had never planned on any of this. Garver has said that her parents made a point of protecting her earnings in a way that other families in the cast, by her own account, did not manage to do, a distinction that reads very differently once you know what happened to the money Anissa Jones and Johnny Whitaker were each supposed to inherit. After the show ended, Garver earned a master's degree in theater arts from UCLA and studied at London's Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, building a career that stretched into narration, voiceover work, writing, and public speaking, alongside decades of stage and screen credits. She recorded more than 30 audiobooks, won an Audie Award for her narration work, wrote a memoir called Surviving Sissy about her life during and after the show, and later co-authored a book profiling other former child stars. In 1981, she married David Travis, a home video and entertainment industry executive, and the two remained together for 44 years, raising a son, Reed. Travis died on August 30th, 2025, at 79, following a battle with metastasized colorectal cancer, a loss Garver spoke about publicly and with evident grief in the months that followed. In 2026, at